There is a link in the description where you can register for our raffle for a free ticket to the Mises Institute event April 26th in Phoenix, Arizona on bureaucracy with Dr. Robert Malone, Tom Woods, and Tom DiLorenzo. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Minor Issues Podcast. I'm Mark Thornton at the Mises Institute. Well, I've gotten several comments from both listeners and friends complaining about the lack of good, positive news on the Minor Issues Podcast. Why are we always pointing out and harping on the negatives and what is wrong with the world? We actually hear that a good deal at the Mises Institute in general, and I've heard similar criticisms throughout my career. I'm going to explain my response in this episode. My answer also helps to explain the title of this podcast, Minor Issues. What is the human trend? There are many important twists and turns in human history, but from a very long perspective, the history of humans can be seen as a very positive, upward-sloping trend line in all the important standard of living markers, such as population or characteristics such as longevity. From this long-term perspective, what we consider historic events are actually just blips along the long trend. For example, one strand of this progress is language. Long ago, all we could do was grunt, groan, and shriek. We have since developed the ability to communicate complex thoughts, emotions, ideas, developed complex alphabets and languages, developed the ability to write, to print, to record, and have created vast libraries of history, culture, including data, audio, video, and including computer languages and software, etc. By their very nature, trends are a mathematical abstraction and, for example, are not accurate for all humans at any point in time. Trends also abstract away from all the twists and turns in human progress. Climate disasters and the rise and fall of empires have caused huge deviations from the trend line. Austrian economists don't talk about trends much, or trend lines, or plot trend lines on graphs, or base forecasting, or predictions on trends. We look at choices on the margin, deviations from the trends, and the reason for changes in forecasted trends. We don't ignore trends, but that's not our focus. The deviation from trends is the short-term, big picture for Austrian economists, such as the current business cycle. And this is really the bread and butter of the Minor Issues Podcast. One reason for the lack of focus on trends is that many trends are endogenous to humans. This means that the trends are natural or inherent or internally driven. The longer the trend, the more naturally inherent it obviously is to humans. The desire and ability of humans to progress often outweighs the ill-conceived and disastrous policies of politicians and tyrants. Shorter-term trends can be attributed to fads and fancy, or bad things that creep into ideology of humanity that distort trends, like a malignancy in the body. In a free market economy, the trend of economic growth is a function of the human choices to save and invest, and is relatively stable over time. Therefore, overall trends in humanity can probably be thought of as endogenous, abstracting away from all the 1 year, 10-year, and even 100-year aberrations and deviations, anomalies, and dry holes in the human endeavor. For an example of one of these long-term dry holes is socialist ideology. It is important to note that all of the numerous positive aspects of human progress, including things like language and alphabets, the use of numbers and money, are tied to the expanding of ability of humans to trade, a topic I recently explored in a paper which will be published soon on the subject of Ludwig von Mises's views on trade and policy. And I leave a link to that paper below. The following individual trends are all pretty obvious to everyone. Food is an evident trend. Starting with the beginning of humanity, we were scavengers living off the land, migrating with the seasons, rummaging, gathering, and hunting, and often starving to death. Scavenge sounds like savage, and with good reason in my book. It's just above cannibalism. In our early days, without any property rights, humans made many species extinct. That progressed more with property rights to things like agriculture, domesticated animals, irrigation, genetics, tractors, fertilizers, etc. The long-term trend in food is obviously way up. In contrast, a short-term deviation would be a widespread drought or pestilence, killing off crops or domesticated animals on a wide scale. Population is another obvious, very long trend upward in the upward direction. I did a unanimity podcast episode on this topic that you can click below to listen to. Power is an obvious trend as well. Early on, we only had human power. Human labor was everything, and the labor theory of value was popular and in vogue up until very recently. Then we learned to use things like animals to assist us. So we had horsepower, and much later, the wind to power little boats for transportation. You know the routine: steam power and engines, coal and electricity, nuclear power, etc. Technology is a key marker of the human trend, but it can also mislead people's thinking. Technology is first and foremost an entrepreneurial byproduct of the other trends. Yes, technological developments do lead to human advancement, but historians often treat such developments as surprises from independent geniuses or godlike intervention or some forward-looking government research program. Modern mainstream economists admit that they don't understand technology or how to use it in their models. In fact, the evidence is clear. 1. Technological developments proceed from previous human development, not the other way around. New technological developments spring from developed, not undeveloped societies. 2. Developed societies has savings and capital, stability and learning, and most of all, trading and entrepreneurship, where individuals regularly tinker away at how to better make a buck, better or cheaper products, and ultimately brand new ways and products. Think of the Wright brothers, the bicycle makers. 3. Government sometimes does capture and channel human resources into certain technological ventures, but they are mainly just taking and pressing existing resources into their pet chosen projects by force, many of which are up to no good in military applications. A common theme embedded in all these individual trends is capital. The improvement in food, population, power, and technology is capital, where labor could be diverted to manipulate raw materials to form some tool or structure. And capital is where humans have created something new on the earthly landscape. Note that the initial diversion of labor requires some sustaining savings as a prerequisite, and savings implies property rights to those savings. Property rights, savings, and capital accumulation is why some areas are more prosperous than others, and those prosperous or advanced areas highlight historical trends. Capital is not only what raises each of the individual trends, it is also what elevates the long run human trend upward off of the horizontal axis. Our natural state prior to capital and capitalism is poverty, subsistence, and a precarious existence. Just piling up rocks and branches in a stream like a beaver, holding back water for drinking, fishing, or irrigation purposes counts as capital and technology. Having a solid system of property rights and savings that can be turned into capital is a big step forward in the human trend. The trend upward experienced an upward shift over the last couple of thousand years, which roughly coincides with history. Then, a few hundred years ago, there were positive developments we generally call money and banking, which appear to have dramatically shifted the trend upward. Depending on your graph paper and what you happen to be measuring on the vertical axis, the more recent human trend appears to be going hyperbolically upward. However you graph this, the last period, the one we are currently in, is capitalism, a system where cooperating individuals transform savings and ideas into capital through the portal of institutions known as banks and stocks and bonds. It is capital that increases food, population, longevity, technology, and the overall standard of living, as well as transforming human thought and our horizons. The Minor Issues podcast is about the current deviations from that trend process.